Hi guys, welcome to part 4 of this Angular 7 tutorial series. In this video we'll be setting up our login form, which will use an authentication service for logging into our application, and we'll add a route guard to our homepage route which will restrict access to that, so you'll need to be logged in to access the homepage. As with the other videos, I've posted all the steps that we'll be going through under my blog, and I'll put a link to this post in the video description. In order to try to keep the video relatively brief, I'll be going through the steps fairly quickly and covering the main pieces of code, but if you want to know more about the details of any of the steps, I've provided more details in the blog posts as well as links to articles and other documentation. Okay, let's get started. Well, the first step that we'll be actually doing, which I forgot to mention, is we'll also be setting up a fake backend so we can test and run our Angular app without a real backend API. The fake backend is set up using the JWT Interceptor interface of Angular, and this allows you to intercept HTTP requests from your Angular app. Now, the interceptor can either modify those requests and pass them through to the backend API, or you can send a response directly back from your interceptor, which is how the fake backend will work. The first step we'll do is create a helpers folder, which is what we'll put our fake backend into. The folder is prefixed with an underscore, which is what I like to do with any folders holding shared code or non-feature code, to differentiate it and things like services components from feature folders like home, login, and register. Okay, so go over to Visual Studio Code and create a helpers folder in the app folder. Alright, the next step is we'll create a file for our fake backend within helpers. Okay, so the main things in the fake backend are that we have a hard-coded array of users that we'll be using in place of a real backend API. So the username of test and password of test we'll be able to use to log in to the app once we finish this video. The main function here is the handle route function, and it checks to see what path you're trying to access and decides based on that whether it's going to send a mocked response or a fake response back or pass it through to the real backend. At the moment we just have a single route faked, which is for authentication. It passes that to the authenticate function, otherwise it calls next.handle, which passes it through to the real backend. The authenticate function grabs the username and password out of the request body, and it checks to see if it finds a user that matches in the hard-coded array that I showed before. If it doesn't find a matching user, it returns an error with the message of username and password is incorrect. Otherwise it returns an OK response with a fake JWT token in the response. Down here we have another constant for the fake backend provider, and this is the configuration for adding the fake backend interceptor into our registering it with our app module. Okay, so if we copy that code and back in VS Code, paste it in there. Alright, the next step is we're going to create a barrel file in our helpers folder. Now, a barrel file is an index file that re-exports all of the components from that folder, so you can import the components in other parts of the application with just the folder path. It also allows you to import multiple components with a single import statement, so it just makes it a bit nicer when you're importing from other parts of the application. So I'll create index.ts and we'll export our fake backend from that file. Okay, next up we'll add our fake backend to the app module, or register it with our app module. Now that involves two changes to our app module, so we'll add a providers section and include the fake backend provider, and we import the fake backend provider from helpers up here. So we can open up our app module and add the fake backend provider, and then we'll add the providers array and include the fake backend provider. Okay, now the fake backend interceptor is registered as an HTTP interceptor in our app module. Alright, moving on to the next step. We'll create a global config object. Now what this will be used for is to have any global configuration information that you want to have available throughout the application. One of the obvious things that it can be used for is what we're using it for here, for an API URL. The way we set up a global config object with Webpack is you can use the Webpack define plugin, and what that does is when Webpack bundles up your code, the output will have a global config object that's accessible anywhere in the application. So let's open up our Webpack config.js and add the define plugin call here. We also need to add the Webpack constant in the top up here. So we'll add that line. Okay, moving on to the next step. Now, because Webpack is not part of the TypeScript project, it's generating the global config object in the output JavaScript, our application might complain about it not knowing about this global config object. The TypeScript compiler might not like it, might complain that it doesn't exist. So to get around that, you can create a custom typings file which adds type declarations for cases like this. So we'll create our typings file in the source folder, and then add our global config object. And as the comment says there, it's so the TypeScript compiler doesn't complain about our global config object. Alright, moving on. Next we'll create our Authentication Service. Now this service will go into the services folder, so we'll create that first. Again, it has the underscore prefix because it contains shared code that can be used throughout the app. The Authentication Service has a method for logging in and logging out. The login method sends a request to the Backend API using the config API URL that we just set up, and logs the user in here. The Logout method logs the user out. It uses RxJS observables and subjects in order to maintain the logged in state for the user, and I've got some extra information and other links to learn more about that up here if you're interested. It has a couple of public properties as well. One is for getting the current user value if you want to find out if they're logged in, and the other one is the current user observable that you can subscribe to, and that's if you have a component that wants to be notified anytime the user logs in or out in order to make changes to the UI or fire off any other code on that event. Alright, so first I'll grab the file name, so we'll create the authentication service in the services folder, and then paste that code in there. Alright, moving on to next, we'll create a barrel file also in the services folder, so we can import any of the services just via the folder name. Index file and add the export of the authentication service. Next we'll import the Reactive Forms module and HTTP client module into our app module. Now that's because we'll be using Reactive Forms to implement our login form with validation and everything else we need. for submitting the form, and the HTTP client module contains everything we need for sending requests and communicating with backend APIs via HTTP. To add those to our app module, we'll import them first here. So opening up our app module file again, add those here, and we'll add them to the imports array within the app module to make everything from those modules available to everything within our app module. Okay, next step is to add our form logic to our login component. So this is the component which sits behind the actual login form. So it has a login form property here, which is a form group, and it has a couple of properties for or form controls, one for username, one for password. It initializes those to empty strings and sets them to required by using the validators.required. When the form is submitted, it uses the Authentication Service and calls login and passes the username and password. On success, it navigates to the return URL, which is either the URL that they were trying to access before hitting the login page. It grabs it from the query params up here. And if there's an error, it sets the error property to the message of the error and sets loading to false, which will be reflected in the UI. So have I created that yet? Yep, so obviously we have that login component already from our last video. So we just need to copy that code and replace what we've got in our login component. Alright, next we'll add our form HTML to the login component template. Alright, so our HTML includes a div up the top which will display if there's an error, so that's the error property before. If login fails, it'll display the error message at the top. The form is bound to the form group in the login component using this form group directive, and the submit event is bound to the onSubmit method here. Each of the input fields is displayed here and here. The form control name binds it to the form control name attribute binds it to the username field in the form group, or the username control rather. And the ng class will display error messages if the form has been submitted and if it has errors. So that's to make it so the error messages or validation messages will only appear after the first attempt at submitting the form. Down here we disable the submit button or the login button while it's loading, and display a spinner using some bootstrap classes. Okay, so let's copy that. Open our login component template. Paste that in there. Alright, next up, so we'll add Logout and ShowHide functionality to our app component. So we want to be able to hide the main navigation when the user's not logged in, and when they are logged in, show the main nav, and also have a link on the main nav to allow the user to log out. So the logic for that in here, we have in our app component we'll have a current user property which will subscribe to the Authentication Service current user observable. So that'll be updated when the user logs in and out. And then in the app component template that we'll see next, we can toggle the nav on and off based on the value of that property. The logout method will be used also from the main nav, and when that's fired, it'll call Authentication Service.logout, which will log us out of the app, and then we'll redirect to the login form. Okay, so we can copy that and open app component and replace the code in there with our logic here. Next up, we'll update the nav within our app component template. So what we want to have is the nav to have a link to the home page, which will be our only secure page initially, and a logout link to allow you to log out of the application. Here's the bit of Angular code that will show and hide the nav depending on whether the user's logged in or not. So if you copy the nav and go over to app component and just replace that code there. And next we'll be creating a route guard to restrict access to our homepage route, so only authenticated users will be able to access it. Within our route guard, we're checking if the current user has a value here. If it does, we return true, which means the route can be activated. Otherwise, it returns false, which cancels the current route, and we'll navigate to the login page, passing the current URL as a return URL parameter in our query param, so the user can be redirected back to the page that they were looking for after logging in. Okay, so if we first we'll copy the name of the file that we want, auth.guard.ts, then create a file in helpers. Okay, then copy the code, and now we have our auth guard ready to go. Next up, we'll just add the auth guard to our helpers barrel file. Okay, now we'll add the auth guard to our homepage route, which will restrict access to the homepage route to users that are logged in. So within our app routing module, we'll import our auth guard, and add it to the can activate array of the home component. Okay, so app.routing.ts, import the auth guard, and on the home component, can activate array, we'll add the auth guard. Okay, now our home route is guarded by that route guard. Next, we'll create a JWT Interceptor. So the JWT Interceptor will intercept all requests from the Angular application, and if the user is logged in, then it will automatically add an authorization header with the current user's JWT token to that request. It allows you to have this code centralized and only written once, rather than having to add the auth header in every place that you're making a HTTP request. So down here, we're checking if the user is logged in and if there's a token on the user object. If there is, it sets the HTTP header here for authorization to the current user's token. Okay, so create the file, JWT Interceptor. We'll put that into the helpers folder as well. And paste in the code there. And we'll add the JWT Interceptor to the barrel file of the helpers folder. Okay, next we'll create an error interceptor. This is a global interceptor that will check the response of all requests that get sent to the backend, and if there's an error, it will it behaves differently depending on the type of error. So if the error is a 401 unauthorized from the API, it'll log the user out automatically and reload the app, which will redirect the user effectively to the login page. Otherwise, if it's any other type of error, it'll grab the error message out of the HTTP response, by checking the error message property or defaulting to the status text of the HTTP response, and then it rethrows that error with just the error message to make it more easily consumable by the component or piece of code that initiated the request. So we'll create the error interceptor file and helpers. And copy in code there. Alright, as with the others, we'll add the error interceptor to our barrel file. Okay, now we'll register those two new HTTP interceptors in our app module. The way we do that is by adding it to the providers array of the app module. We set the provide property to the HTTP interceptors token, which is part of the Angular common HTTP package up here, and we tell it to use each of those classes. Now, setting this property of multi-true means that you're adding multiple interceptors and chaining them together effectively, so each of them gets run one after the other. So first we'll add the HTTP interceptors token to the imports of our app module, and then import both of our interceptors. So as I mentioned before, this is one of the benefits of having a barrel file. You can import multiple things from just the folder path rather than having to have multiple import statements. And then we'll add our two providers to the providers array. Save that. Okay, that's it. Now we can test our application and hopefully it all works if we haven't missed anything. So opening up a command window, cd into projects folder, Angular 7 tutorial, and run npm start. Okay, it looks like I'd logged in already before when I was testing, but there we have it. Our application is up and running with our changes. We can see our login form. We can see that it's not displaying any error messages yet because we haven't submitted the form. If I try to submit, then the error messages are displayed, or the validation messages are displayed saying the username and password are required. If I put in an incorrect username and password, you can see the spinner appear briefly as it was loading, and then the error message come back and display there. And if I enter the correct username and password of test and test, we are now logged in and looking at the secure homepage. And our updated navigation showing the logout and home links appears when you're logged in, and if I log out, it disappears. So it looks like everything's working. Okay, that's it. Hope you enjoyed the video. Thanks for watching. If you want to see more, don't forget to subscribe to my channel below. Alright, thanks.